Hi guys, my name is Angela and welcome to my YouTube channel. I am so glad for the end of February. We have had heat wave after heat wave here in Perth. I think we had three instances of like 3 days above 40 degrees Celsius. It was awful. Like I have never seen my garden quite so fried by the heat. And I feel like I haven't been outside all month because you just want to stay inside and keep cool in the air conditioning. But we're now into March and we had some rain recently, and autumn is my favorite season of the year. And so I'm so glad for that to be just around the corner. Today I'm going to share with you my recent reads from February. And normally I would also share some of my favorite things for the month. But this month, all of my favorite things were kind of health related, not book related at all. So I thought I'd skip it this month and maybe pick it up next month. We'll see. My focus was definitely more on my health and some of my family members' health. But let me know if you're interested in knowing that sort of stuff. If it's something you want to hear about in the future, whether I'm talking about books or health stuff or skincare or whatever it is that's, blowing up my skirt, let me know in the comments if you do want to hear about that. Otherwise, I'll just stick to the books this week. It was a good month for books. I read 5 books, which is pretty good for me. I didn't race through them. It was something that I was conscious of with doing these videos. I didn't want to feel like I was racing against a clock or having to hit a quota, and I didn't feel that at all. There were a few days where I didn't pick up a book at all. But I read 5 books and they are all fiction, which was interesting. I didn't realize until just recently they're all fiction books. On my last reading wrap up, someone commented that I should probably share my rating for the books. And I've hesitated on doing that in the past because I am not a professional book reviewer, and my criteria for a 5-star or a 4-star, 1-star book is probably not the same as a book reviewer. So I don't want people to see this and feel like, oh, Ange said that it's a 5-star read, so it's going to be up there. But 5-star is just a book that I like, probably a book that I will want to revisit in the future, and is by no means a critique on the technical nature of writing or that particular book. That all said, I'm going to give you some reviews on this one. I'm going to give you my star ratings that I've given. Again, there's no real science behind how I give a rating. I find it quite hard to do that myself, but I'm trying to do it so I can at least get some kind of indication of the books that I'm enjoying. So I'm going to share that with you in this video. Before we start, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that commented on my last video, the bedside table reads. Thank you for commenting and wishing me well and to get well soon. Okay, let's get into some reads for February. The first book I read was The Secret River by Kate Grenville. I mentioned this book in my video on Australian authors to read during a heat wave, and I had never read it. I had been lent this by someone and I just never got to it. And part of the reason is because I knew the subject matter was going to be tough. It was going to be quite confronting, and I was not wrong. This was published in 2005, so it's a few years old. Oh my gosh, that's almost 20 years old now. But it is still super relevant today. My own history as an Australian is that I am a first-generation Australian. My parents immigrated here in the early 70s from England and New Zealand. So I'm a first-generation Australian. To my knowledge, I don't have ancestral ties to colonisation in Australia, but I do to Britain. So there is a connection, with the whole colonisation of Australia. It's a sensitive subject in Australia at the moment. While I don't have connection to colonisation specifically, I do feel a connection to this story. The story is from the perspective of William Thornhill. When we meet him, he is a boy. He falls in love with a girl named Sal, and he ends up becoming a Thames boat captain, just ferrying people across the Thames. And he ends up working for Sal's dad, and so he takes over their business. Eventually, Will is convicted for a crime of stealing, and instead of being sentenced to hang, he's sentenced to go to the penal colony in New South Wales in Australia. To be honest, the first part of the book in England was a bit of a slog. I just wanted to get to the Australia part of it. And as Will and Sal and their children arrive in New South Wales, I think it's after a 2-year period, Will is emancipated from his conviction. So during that 2-year period, while he's technically a convict of sorts, Sal and Will are just biding their time until they can go back to England where their family is, what they know is there. But then Will starts to realise that they probably have a better chance of a better life in Australia because there's all this land for the taking that appears to be owned by nobody. So this is set in the early 19th century. People start forcibly taking land from the people already living in this area, and Will takes a place. He takes a piece of land on the Hawkesbury River in New South Wales that's going to be his family's land. They're going to farm there. And there's a lot of tension as Will and his family start to interact with the Indigenous people that live in the area. At first, there's quite a few really nice exchanges where you can see them trying to communicate, but you can see that you know where it's going, and that's what's really heart-wrenching about this story. But Kate Grenville's writing is really lovely. There's a little piece, a passage from when Will gets onto his land that I just wanted to read to you quickly. So this was from when Will first arrives on his new land. So we're almost halfway through the book at this point. So the first half is quite a lot of preparation, and now they're on their own land. So the passage is after Will's family has just arrived on their land, and he's ready to start his new life here because England did not do him any favours. To be stretched out to sleep on his own earth, feeling his body lie along the ground that was his, he felt he'd been hurrying all his life and had at last come to a place where he could stop. He could smell the rich damp air coming in the tent flap. He could feel the shape of the ground through his back. My own, he kept saying to himself. My place, Thornhill's place. But the wind in the leaves up the ridge was saying something else entirely. It's really lovely writing, but some of the characters are horrific, absolutely horrible people. It was truly heartbreaking at times to see the things that were happening to the local Indigenous people by settlers who considered themselves better. This is a loaded book, and I highly recommend it. It's a book that I wanted to read for its importance, but it's a narrative that I think everybody should really read. I don't know if I'll read it again. It's quite confronting at times, but I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And if you are thinking about reading it, I do recommend you read it because it is a great piece of historical fiction of Australia's history around the settlement around New South Wales in the early 19th century. I recommend it, and I'm so glad I finished it. The next book I read was The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. And a fun fact is that Elizabeth von Arnim is Australian. I had no idea she was. I thought for sure she was just British all the way through. To be honest, she's probably a first-generation Australian herself. But The Enchanted April was something on my list for a while, so much that I actually ended up with 2 copies of it somehow. I must have just bought it accidentally twice because I didn't realise I already had it. But it was on my list for a long time. And so The Enchanted April was published in 1922. I started this book I think I started reading it, but then I flipped between audio and reading. I have about a 40-minute commute to work, and I've been driving lately. So if I'm catching transport, I'll read, but if I'm driving, I'll listen to a book. So I flip between the two of them. The Enchanted April opens in a dreary February in London, and Mrs. Wilkins is reading an advertisement, and she sees there's an advert for a villa in Italy to be rented for the month of April. And it sounds heavenly. She wants to go, but of course she can't afford to do that by herself. And she ends up seeing an acquaintance of hers, Mrs. Arbuthnot, also read the article, and they get into their heads that they can do this. They can rent this out if they can find 2 more ladies to pitch in for the rent for the month, and they can get away from their neglectful husbands and their responsibilities. So these 4 women really do not know each other at all, and it really leads to some interesting exchanges. Some of my favourites were when they were sitting down to tea, and Mrs. Arbuthnot felt like she was the hostess because she was one of the, it was her and Mrs. Wilkins that put this whole thing together. But the older woman that was there, Mrs. Fisher, took the instant position of hostess. And so this tit for tat kind of thing of them trying to both be the hostess was really, I found it quite funny to read all the time. And then when it came to them arriving at the villa, and the cook was like, I just need someone to tell me what it is you're eating, who's going to pay the staff and that kind of thing. And everyone just kept passing responsibility to the next person. None of them wanted responsibility. They just wanted to enjoy the location they were in and enjoy that 1 month they had away from all their responsibilities. There's a few twists and turns at the end, but it's just a smooth summer read. I really recommend it for summer, of course. Some of the writing about the gardens and the location they're in is really lovely. As the month goes on, the different flowers are coming out, and that was really nice to read as well. And I give it 4.5 stars. It's all about female companionship and friendship and transformation and love. It's a really easy read, and I highly recommend it. It's uncomplicated, but it will leave you feeling very warm at the end. And my next book, I finally did it. I finished Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. This is my first Jane Austen, and I am so glad I read it. I think the only reason I picked this up in February was because of Valentine's Day. I was having a look through my collection of books that might be considered romantic or romance books, and this was right up there. And after the success of listening to the Enchanted April on audio, I realized I still had a book on Audible that I cancelled my subscription a while ago. But I had one on Audible, which was Pride and Prejudice, narrated by Rosamund Pike. So I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a go. And I did the same thing where I flipped back and forth between the print and the audio. It's really such a great way to get into classics, to books that are not written in a contemporary style that have a dialogue. It's a really good way to get into that by having an audio book that you can, even if you can read it as you listen to it, to get into the rhythm and the cadence of the book. And then if you want, you can let the audio go and then just keep reading. I found it really useful when I was trying to read Wuthering Heights in particular, because there's a lot of dialect and the way it's written just does not make sense at times. So it's a really good tip. And I know a few people mentioned that in my BookTube newbie video, that audio was a great way to get into the classics. So I highly recommend it too. I'm sure I don't need to provide a summary on this, but I will try, because that's part of the reason why I'm doing this on BookTube, is to get better at explaining books. So written by Jane Austen and published in 1813, this is Regency era romance, and it's from the perspective of Elizabeth Bennet, who is the second eldest of 5 daughters. Lizzie is undoubtedly one of the most famous heroines of literature, not just English literature, but literature in general. And there's a reason for it. You know, she is so witty, she is so intelligent, and she is very opinionated. And when she meets the proud Mr. Darcy, they instantly rub each other the wrong way. Personally, I love a book that has elements of its time. So Pride and Prejudice has elements of social class, gender roles, and it's a slow burn romance. The end of the book, oh my gosh, the end, it's so romantic. The writing, as Lizzie realizes how much she loves Mr. Darcy, the writing is just beautiful. I was smiling as I was reading it. It was so gorgeous. And I knew the story of Pride and Prejudice. I am a big fan of the BBC production, the TV series with Colin Firth and Jennifer Eels. I do like the Keira Knightley one. If I had to choose one or the other, it would probably be the BBC. But I knew the story. There were still elements in here that I found interesting and added to the story for me, to the narrative. But yeah, Lizzie's inner dialogue as she realised how wrong she'd been about Mr. Darcy and how much she loved him was just beautiful, sublime. I encourage you to read the book, even if you've seen the series or watched the movie. I encourage you to read the book as well. It's 200 years later. It's still a classic for a reason, and it's a theme that has been told over and over. And I give it 4.5 stars. It could be 5, I think. Like I said, I don't have a scientific reason behind my criteria. I think the reason I didn't go for 5 is because the language, from today's perspective, the language can be quite hard to read. I think that's the only reason why. But it's made me want to pick up another Jane Austen, which might be Persuasion next. I think I've got Persuasion, Emma, and Sandition. I've got all these copies, but I just haven't read them. So I'm going to be demolishing Jane Austen now. 4.5 stars, Pride and Prejudice. The next book I read was Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This was a book that was in my most recent book haul video. And a number of you were actually excited for me to read it too, because you had it on your shelf or on your wish list and you just wanted to kind of get a bit more information about how it actually read. I read this over 2 nights while I was in hospital in February. So I was very glad for the escape read that this is. And it's a retelling of a Greek myth. It was published in 2021. So it's pretty recent. But in terms of the story, I don't know there's so many Greek myths, right? So I don't know if Ariadne is her own myth in her own right, or if she is just a side story to these other men. She's a key element in the story of King Minos, of the Minotaur, who is her brother, of Dionysus, the god of winemaking and mischief. And this story itself is from 2 perspectives. You know, the excerpt on the back does mention Ariadne and her sister Phaedra, but I thought it was going to be all from Ariadne's perspective. It switches narration from Ariadne and Phaedra throughout. So the first narration is from Princess Ariadne, who is the eldest daughter of King Minos and Pasiphae. Pasiphae is the daughter of the sun god Helios. She has a direct lineage to the gods of Olympus. And she's also old enough to remember the awful story of how her brother, the Minotaur, came into being. And she is traumatized by that, not just how he came to be and the shame that it brought on her family, but also living with the knowledge of her brother in this labyrinth and causing havoc through an annual sacrifice to the Minotaur every year that her father does. The second narration is from Phaedra, Ariadne's younger sister. Phaedra is a little bit less miserable than Ariadne, and I think it's because she just doesn't remember when the Minotaur was born. So she's a little less miserable and has a little more hope for her future. So the book opens up to the next annual sacrifice. There's 13 people, I think, who are brought in from Athens who are going to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And this is King Minos, the king of Crete, this is his legacy that he is doing to keep up people under his thumb. When the people from Athens come, Ariadne sees Theseus, who is a prince of Athens, who has literally volunteered as tribute to come and be a sacrifice for the Minotaur rather than one of his subjects come along. Ariadne falls in love with Theseus and he falls in love with her, and she and her sister help him defeat the Minotaur, and they're supposed to leave, and Ariadne and Theseus are going to marry, and she's going to have a new life, a positive life right ahead of her. So while Theseus is successful in his mission, Ariadne is left and abandoned on an isolated island, and that's really where the story goes into a place I did not know. I knew, the Minotaur story, but her story just branches out in so many directions I did not realize. And that was only the first third of the book, right? So it was very, very quick getting through that key story. But after she was on the island, we got this really interesting look into the god Dionysus, which was someone, I don't really think that I have read much about Dionysus in the past. So it was really compelling to understand his origin story and who he was. My issue with the book was that the narration switch between Phaedra and Ariadne, it was easy to know because every chapter noted who the narrator was, but I felt like in reading it, they were the same person. I had to stop and kind of go back and think, hang on, whose perspective is this? So I felt like there weren't like any real features that defined the two of them as two separate personalities. They felt like the same person somehow. The writing is also a little vague and poetic at times, that you have to read between the lines so much that I was reading sentences over and over and over to understand what had just happened, because it was never a literal statement saying, what was going on. So that was another thing that I think was a downfall for me. But I'm glad I read it, and I gave it 3 stars. And the last book I read for February was The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This was another book from my recent book haul, and I had a free morning over the weekend, and I thought, I'm going to do it. I reckon I could read that in an hour, and I did. This book was published, or this story was published originally in 1952, which is just short of 10 years before Hemingway died. And this won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and I think really catapulted Hemingway's works into another stratosphere. He was already popular, but it just gave him a real boost. I just devoured it. The book opens up in Havana and is about the old man is Santiago, who is an old man who is down on his luck. So much so that the young boy that is perhaps his only friend is told by his parents not to fish with Santiago anymore because he is bad luck and he hasn't caught a fish in 84 days. The relationship between the boy and the man, the old man, is really tender and endearing. I really did enjoy reading that part. But then the old man gets up on the 85th day and he's like, I'm going to catch that fish. And so he goes out by himself. I think this is a story that everyone can read it and they get the same story. It's about an old man and he is battling a fish and he's trying to get it back to land. But there are so many subtexts, I think, involved that as you read it more and more, or different people from different stages of life will probably pick up different things. There's elements of aging, of courage, relationships, beauty. And I think the next time I read this book will be at a slower pace for my reading, and I'll probably pick up different subtexts each time I pick it up. For me, this time around when I read it, the main things I got out of it, I guess, was the oceanic themes, the descriptions of the coastline, of the water, of the flora and fauna, dolphins, flying fish, sharks, and of course the big fish that he caught were all really enchanting. And the old man's courage as he fought for 3 days to catch this fish was really, really captivating. It was gripping for me. Hemingway's writing is just very simple. You know, sometimes when you're reading it, you're like, this is just basic. You know, the dialogue of him with the boy is very, very simple. But then you get this little sentence and it's just like, boom. And so usually when I read Hemingway, I am stopping and I'm taking a note of a sentence and trying to capture that somewhere so I can reference it later. And one of the things that I picked up was a slight little paragraph after Santiago had caught the fish. I don't think I'm giving you any spoilers. This book is over 50 years old. The paragraph is his inner dialogue as he's coming home. And it's, you did not kill the fish only to keep alive and to sell for food, he thought. You killed him for pride and because you are a fisherman. You loved him when he was alive and you loved him after. If you love him, it is not a sin to kill him, or is it more? You think too much, old man, he said aloud. So the relationship between the old man and the fish is really interesting. I think there's so many layers to this book that I will come back to and they will unfurl as time goes on. I gave this 5 stars and I will read it again and again. This month I have no idea what I'm going to read. I'm going to just take it as it comes. I do have a couple of books that I started in January that I haven't yet finished, and I want to get them done, I think. And then who knows? I think the fact that I read quite a few historical fictions, I think I'll probably pick up something like that again. But otherwise, the world is my oyster, so to speak, when it comes to what I'm going to read next. I referenced a few books from my book haul, so I'll leave a card here for you if you want to go back and look at that video. And I hope you have a lovely week ahead, a lovely March ahead of you, and I will see you next weekend. Bye.